Great. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So not only do we have a presentation by 3 amazing guests today, but Interaction is also launching the publication of 6 new case examples that represent how organizations have adopted various aspects of results-based protection. So you see here on the slide 6 examples, and all of these can be found on our website. We have a variety of different case examples. We'll be showcasing 3 of them, but not all of them are focused on community-led protection, but different aspects and components of results-based protection. So you'll see the first one here that's listed is from ACF. Very excited to show a multidisciplinary approach to protection. So this is ACF's work in integrating protection and nutrition in Burkina Faso and DRC. So really interesting case example. We also have Nonviolent Peace Force, who is here today talking with us about how do you create a culture of civilian-led protection, and specifically looking at Ukraine. NRC also is another publication who is also with us today, looking at safeguarding civilian space in Afghanistan. We did also a historical case example. So this isn't one particular organization per se, but looked at a protection issue, which was the prevention of recruitment of and the use of children in armed groups, and looked at that over a period of, I believe, 10 years to understand how different organizations adopted different approaches to achieve protection outcomes. So that's a very fascinating case example. We have Oxfam as well, sharing their community-based protection methods in Lebanon. And also another presenter today as well that we'll be showcasing is a people-centered approach, which looks at recognizing communities as the experts. So really exciting case examples that we're excited to share. And just so you get a little taste of this, when you go to our website, if you switch the slides, you'll see them nicely highlighted. They each have photographs that you can download specifically. You can also switch the language if you need it in another language. And if you go to the next slide, when you upload each of the case examples, what's neat about this is that not only do you read the case examples, there are little pop-ups. Here you'll see this little red icon as you read the text, and a pop-up will appear that tells you why this is an RBP point. And so it will share with you not only that you can read and kind of get the scope of what this case is about, but very specifically helps you think through that this is an RBP approach because it focuses on this, this, or this. We also have what we call RBP enablers, which I'll talk about in just a minute, that also talk about how you can engage within your organization, whether that's through resources or your systems or even the culture, that can help you adopt this approach as well. So it's a very interactive way to read the case examples, and we hope that that's helpful as you read through them and try to understand whether or not your own organization is using and applying results-based approaches. So that's kind of our first kind of pitch in terms of the publication, the launch of these 6 examples. But before we get started in actually showcasing 3 of them, I want to make sure that we all understand what we mean when we say results-based protection. So I'm going to give a very short little introduction to results-based protection and what Interaction has been doing over the last couple of years on this. So do you want to go to the next slide? And the next one. So first off, just want to make sure that we all understand what we mean by protection. Now, there is an ISC definition. It's much broader than this, but what we have identified that when trying to achieve a protection outcome and to operationalize protection, it's easier for humanitarians to understand a very specific definition. And so what we focus on is how people who are experiencing a crisis feel that they are free from violence, coercion, or deliberate deprivation. So that's ultimately what protection is. We're looking at the goal of protection and not necessarily the term protecting. So we're very much focused on then achieving a protection outcome, which is ultimately the risk that people are experiencing and how we reduce that. And so in this case, risk is defined as violence, coercion, or deliberate deprivation. So we're looking at how do we reduce that? If we have reduced it or prevented it, that's when we can be more certain that we've achieved a protection outcome. So let's go to the next slide. So very quickly, what is results-based protection? This is the framework that we have been using for a number of years. It's an interagency endorsed framework. It has been tested and piloted across multiple contexts. And it's been shown to be very helpful in helping organizations think about protection issues, which are quite complex, and helping them navigate it in a more fluid and adaptable manner than coming in with kind of preconceived notions of what you think will solve a problem. So in this framework, it's quite simple because we ask just basically 3 questions to help guide you in thinking about your approach. The first question, which is at the top in blue, is, do you know what problem you are trying to solve? And this is fundamental because if we don't understand what the issue is, you're unable to actually figure out what the solutions are to solving that problem. So we emphasize the need to not only do a context-specific protection analysis, but we emphasize that this needs to start from the perspective of affected populations. So it's the people themselves that need to feed into this and drive it for us to very much understand how they define protection so that we can better support them and build upon what they're already doing. We also emphasize the need for this to be continuous. Crises and conflicts, they change, the dynamics are ever, evolving, and so are protection risks as well. So if we're unable to do it in a continuous way, we may not actually be supporting and solving the problems effectively. So that's number 1. The second question, once you've really done a solid analysis, is you want to ask yourselves, do you know who is relevant to solving the problem? And this is important too, because we realize that protection actors alone cannot solve the problem. So different actors may be relevant in different contexts and because of different crises that need to come and to play a role or play a part. That might be protection actors themselves, but it could be a peace builder. It could actually be civil military actors in the environment. It might actually be shelter actors who may have a role. So it's looking at who is relevant to this problem in order to be able to solve the problem as well. So multidisciplinary strategies are critical when trying to achieve a protection outcome. The third question and the third key element that we focus on then is, do you know how you'll solve the problem? So this is now the methods. And what we emphasize is outcome-oriented methods. So it's not coming in with preconceived activities already maybe that are used in other contexts. It's working with populations and understanding what they're already doing, and using methods that are iterative, that are flexible, that are adaptable, that allow us to work with complexity, not only to help analyze the issues, but to design a program as well as to monitor and measure it at the end of the day. So thinking about different methods that are more outcome oriented that can actually help you achieve a protection outcome. So those are 3 key elements. There's much more information and tools and handouts, et cetera, that you can use on our website. I'm happy to talk about this in more detail. But we do also emphasize not only these 3 key elements, but the 3 enablers that you see on the periphery of this circle of what we would say are what you need within your organization in order to be able to apply each of the 3 key elements. So you do need an organizational culture that can embrace this. And there's aspects of that culture that make it more conducive for adopting results-based approaches to protection. You need systems that are in place that are effective, that are enable you to have an adaptive and an iterative approach. And you obviously need the resources and the capacity and the ability to be able to apply some of this as well. So again, you can find more information about each one of those on our website as well. So really quickly before we get in, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an understanding of what this looks like when it comes together. So if you go to the next slide and go ahead. So what we're looking at at the very beginning is understanding that individuals are at risk to various protection issues. And the goal is having that risk reduced. And so we're looking at risk over time on a pathway. And generally, when we often come into a crisis context, we might have a pathway where we think this is the way, we come in with our approach and we have one particular pathway we think that it's going to go on. But in reality, what we find, it's not a straight line or even this kind of slope down line. It's quite different. And if you go click through the slides a bit, what it actually is this iterative, oops, stop, go back. There we go. It's this iterative process. So you may come in and take action, but what you need to do is really emphasize that continuous analysis. And this is where you're coming in, you're engaging with affected populations, you're getting a better understanding of how they understand their risk, how it's actually manifesting in this particular context. And you're looking and trying to measure the changes and patterns of that risk as you've applied a particular action. And it may not have worked. Or you may need to adapt it and change it. So you're learning at the same time. You're continuously doing your analysis, you're applying another method, and you're taking an adapted action. And you kind of go through this cycle throughout the entire time, ultimately until you achieve the protection outcome, which is the reduction of risk. So click through. And one more. There you go. So what you'll see in each of these loops, what you're trying to measure ultimately is the change in attitude, the change in behavior, change in knowledge, policy, and practice, perhaps of perpetrators who may be committing various forms of violence, but you're also looking at the change in attitude, behavior, perhaps of those that are vulnerable to a particular risk or that have the capacity to overcome it. What are they doing that is enabling them to overcome that risk, and how can we capitalize on that as well? And so each one of those loops is helping us look at the results that over time should add up for us to be able to understand reduction of risk. And that's where we want to end up. So that's a very brief aspect of results-based protection, a little bit to show how it works. There's a lot more in this, and I'm only giving you a snippet of it. But what I want to now go into is actually now showing you practically what this looks like. And that's where we come in with our panelists who are going to share with us some of these examples of results-based protection. So go to the next slide. So we are going to share with you and focus very much on that third element. If you remember, that was the outcome-oriented methods. Many of these organizations are using methods that are more outcome oriented, and particularly using the method of starting with affected populations, but not just starting with them, but also engaging with them and enabling communities to lead the entire process from the very beginning to the very end of evaluation. And this is critical, not only because it really represents the heart of results-based protection, but it's also an issue that's of growing recognition within the humanitarian community right now, that very much emphasizes the need that we need to create opportunities for meaningful participation with communities in helping them make those decisions to achieve protection outcomes. We also need to recognize that, as organizations ourselves, we need to hold that space for local communities so that they can define their own protection outcomes and their own solutions. And so to do this, we need not only to use tools and methods that support this type of an approach that allow communities and enable communities to be the front leaders, but we need to develop strategies as well that enable us to have a culture of humility, of being able to listen, to be flexible, to be multidisciplinary in our approach, and really to look at the complexity that's required in thinking about how do you measure protection outcomes. So it's quite a lot in terms of what we need to do as humanitarians, and to shift our thinking away from what we typically do when we respond to really putting communities at the center and to lead a response as well. So let me introduce our panelists. We're going to have 3 panelists that speak to this issue in slightly different ways, and what they and their organizations have been doing. I'll give a much richer background of each of them as we get going. But I wanted to begin with just to indicate that we have Felicity Gray from Nonviolent Peace Force, who will be talking to us about NP's organizational culture and what that looked like in Ukraine. We have Carolina Franceschini from NRC, who will be speaking about the civilian self-protection approach in Afghanistan. And we also have Marta Halak, who's a humanitarian consultant, who will be speaking about a people-centered approach that she's helped develop over the many years and work that she's done with organizations, designing multidisciplinary protection programming in a collaborative way with communities. So let me first begin with Felicity, who is going to kick us off. And so just a bit of a background before she gets going. So Felicity is the Global Head of Policy and Advocacy for Nonviolent Peace Force. She recently just came back from Ukraine as NP's director there. And she's also led some work in South Sudan, particularly in Bentiu, which is the largest displacement camp in the country. So her experience as a practitioner, cuts across unarmed civilian protection. She also works as an expert and academic, and has just recently submitted her dissertation as well on this issue, which had field research in Myanmar, Lebanon, South Sudan, Europe, and the US. So I will turn it over to Felicity to kick us off with the first example.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you all for being here. It's always a privilege to discuss the work that we do and the work that communities are doing. So for NP, fundamentally, our starting point when it comes to practicing civilian protection is civilians themselves. As an organization, we operate using the practice of unarmed civilian protection, or UCP. And UCP is a methodology for the direct protection of civilians and for violence reduction and prevention that centers civilians and communities themselves as agents of that protection. This approach contrasts with how civilian protection is often understood, where safety and security is something that's provided to civilians by the state or by another third party, often through force, rather than safety and security as something that can be co-created or that emanates from communities themselves. UCP protects civilians from violence through a range of nonviolent methods, and I'll talk to you more about what that looks like in practice today, but it includes things like protective accompaniment and protective presence, community-led safety and security initiatives such as early warning and early response mechanisms, civilians protecting one another through community-based protection teams, civilian ceasefire monitoring, the establishment of weapons-free zones, and much more. And when we understand safety and protection as something that needs to reflect and stem from communities themselves, it changes the way that you start to think about protection needs and programming. That's evident across all of our field sites, from Myanmar to Iraq to Sudan to South Sudan to the Philippines to the US. And today I'm going to focus on Ukraine, as Jessica mentioned, where I recently finished up as director. If you can go to the next slide. So last year, like many organizations, we were confronted with a huge scale of civilian protection needs in Ukraine. NP now currently works predominantly in the south and in the east, in the areas that are marked black on the map. But as noted in our case study, we weren't always present. So when needs escalated, we did an assessment, and we didn't go there with a predetermined idea of even whether an NP presence would be a value add. And our first question was, is there space for us to support what communities are already doing here? And going in with such a blank slate can be a daunting prospect, but that's really the only way that we can co-create something with community. It's not about a cookie cutter approach to protection, but about deep listening, deep relationships, and really working alongside communities to complement their pre-existing efforts and to work with them and alongside them to address their protection concerns. And obviously the violence that civilians face in Ukraine is immense. And what we've demonstrated alongside our community partners is the utility of UCP in this environment. And the power really comes from listening and letting communities themselves lead, right from the question of an existence of a program in the first place through to implementation and evaluation. There are multiple examples of different ways that we did this. I think if you can go to the next slide. Our case study focuses on work that we did on protective accompaniment with a local organisation, the 10th of April. They're a legal assistance organisation based in Odessa. And when we met with them early in the assessment, they were really frustrated with the INGOs that had, the few INGOs at that time that had come through Mykolaiv, which was still very hard hit at that point in time, and still is. And 10th of April, hold immense legal expertise themselves, but they were really frustrated by their inability to access people in need of their core services due to the protection risks that were being faced by those communities. So we had a situation where there were many, many IDPs, or internally displaced persons, in Mykolaiv that had moved early on in the conflict from Kherson very quickly. They lacked passports and other civil documentation that you need to access the real basics. So banking, humanitarian services, government services, and the nearest offices available to be able to gain those documents is in Odessa, which is 2 hours, and many, many military checkpoints away. And to get through those military checkpoints, you need the documentation. So you can see the issue and the protection gap here. In addition, at that point, and still, many families lack money for transport. They fear crossing through checkpoints themselves without documentation. And the other thing that 10th of April expressed to us at the time was that they, as a local organization, were doing much more frontline work than bigger organizations, INGOs, but they were doing that without access to the resources and the training that they needed to feel safer. So that included things like access to trauma kits and to PPE, personal protective equipment, in areas where shelling is active, and where, if you're going to work in those areas, you absolutely need those resources, and you absolutely need to know how to use them in the event of injury. And so what we were seeing was local organizations like 10th of April really taking on a huge amount of risk burden when their much bigger INGO and UN agency donors weren't necessarily meeting those security needs. And so from those conversations, we worked with 10th of April and really oriented our programming to those needs. So we collaborated directly with them to design our programming with access to documentation. We started conducting joint protective accompaniments. So we would bring the institutional expertise of unarmed civilian protection. We would negotiate with military actors at the checkpoints to explain the situation. And 10th of April would provide the legal and administrative support. So we would move and organize protective accompaniments from Mykolaiv to Odessa multiple times a week. And so far have held over 30 accompaniments for over 200 people to access that legal support and identification documents. And then as we scaled up, we were able to provide training on safety and security, not only for our teams, but also to groups like 10th of April and to other local association and volunteer groups that face the same issues with not having access to the security expertise that they wanted to have. We did trauma response training, and we now, as part of our pooled fund activities, have a bit of a library almost of personal protective equipment that we share with local organizations that just don't have access to this kind of resource, even though they far and away doing the vast majority of high risk frontline work. So that includes things like bulletproof vests, helmets, and then we train together on the use of those equipment, and help things like, planning evacuation routes and coming up with security plans in advance of activities. And so far we've supported, I think, over 30 organizations in different areas of the country with over 114 sets of PPE. And, this is not just an issue faced by the 10th of April in Ukraine, but also it's a core need expressed by Ukrainian civil society across the country, who feel really disconnected from the resources and the architecture of international humanitarian modalities versus the real work that they're doing. There's a real disparity in Ukraine, where the vast majority of the work is occurring by civil society actors at the grassroots level, volunteer groups, or very small national NGOs. But we're still, despite, I think, rhetoric around this and despite intent even, most of the resources, the vast majority of the resources is still going to large international actors. And as part of that, so you can go to the next slide, Ife. As part of bridging that gap, we have done a number of things, including the network and partnership meeting that's on the screen, to make sure that local organizations can have a direct interface with some of these donors and some of the international architecture to both raise those concerns and to start talking about collaboration. So the event that we held last year featured 60 local organizations and 28 international organizations. For most of the organizations, that was the first time that they'd had an opportunity to share their work and to talk directly with other international actors in that space. And this is part of a broader mapping exercise where we've mapped over 160 local organizations that are responding to needs in the South and the East. We now occupy a pretty unique space in the protection response in Ukraine, where we're simultaneously providing direct protection to at-risk civilians and providing that hands-on technical and operational support to frontline volunteer collectives and national NGOs, as well as advocating for a power shift within this broader response to center local actors and local communities at decision-making levels. Next slide. I'll wrap up here. So fundamentally, I think UCP and our experience in Ukraine is an example of what it means to operationalize RBP principles. It's about orienting our organization toward local agency and expertise from the outset. And it's about putting community understandings and strategies front and center. And as an international organization, that means having a whole lot of humility when it comes to the question of our value add. I'll leave it there and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Felicity. That was really great. And we will dive into more about the program there in the Q&A, but really appreciate your presentation. Next up, we're going to present Carolina Franceschini, who is the thematic advisor on protection of civilians for NRC. So she started working in the humanitarian sector in 2016 and has experience supporting multi-sector interventions in displacement and emergency contexts in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, Vietnam, Colombia, and Afghanistan. So I'm going to turn it over to Carolina. And then before she gets started, I did want to just put a plug in that if you are starting to have questions emerge in your head, please feel free to use the Q&A box that you have in your at the bottom of your screen to put in some questions so we can start to line them up. So go ahead, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone who is listening. So yeah, I would like to briefly present you NRC Civilian Self-Protection Program, and then give you an example of its application in the context of Afghanistan. So NRC Civilian Self-Protection Program is a proactive protection program that uses and promotes a bottom-up approach to protection. So the program really supports and works directly with communities on protection prevention by recognizing that communities and individuals know their context and what they need to feel safer. We know that frequently when it comes to protection programming, we identify risks that are overly broad and require multidisciplinary long-term strategies to be effectively addressed. Whereas for the CSP program, we look at narrowing down as much as possible the risk we want to address, trying to move away from, for example, broad risk of child labor or LGBT, and towards more specific risks, such as, for example, risk of crossfire while at the border point, or risk of verbal harassment from armed actors at a village school. The program really has strong focus on civilian agency. So NRC role is to work in partnership with the community to identify and strengthen existing self-protection capacities in armed conflict or other situations of violence, or we support communities in, for example, developing new self-protection strategies. And we believe that this work, when it's paired with additional protection tools and services, we give communities and individuals the ability to expand their capacities for self-protection, but also we work on building their resilience to address and respond to protection threats. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the CSP protection program currently is implemented in 3 main countries: Colombia, North Central America with Honduras and El Salvador, and Afghanistan. Next slide, please. Next one. Thanks. So the CSP program approaches, of course, recognizes that it is not a one-size-fits-all model, but that the CSP self-capacities, strategies, and mechanism will differ between and within communities with variation, for example, by gender, age, and diversity self-identification. So as a result, the nuances around what a community may decide to implement to help strengthen their self-protection mechanism will be dependent on each community where NRC works. So the program unfolds into a 4-stage process that starts with the community selection, which is based on criteria. We have identified around 14 criteria, such as, for example, proximity to conflict activities, but also community acceptance, presence of conflict-related protection risks within the community, among others. And once a community is selected, NRC then identify existing protection committees, protection groups, or structures, and takes them through a CSP training that has been specifically designed to support communities using only participatory approaches to identify which strategies they want to prioritize, but also which material support may be required to supplement the strategies. And this, of course, can come from us or external organization, but also which additional protection tools will be needed to complement the strategies. So as I said, the strategies will look different to each community and location, and can go from, for example, reinforcing physical civilian structures, or identify safe escape routes, or civilian-led negotiations, targeted advocacy towards armed actors. So it's really related to what the communities decide to prioritize. So after the potential mitigation measures are identified, NRC continues to mentor and engage with the communities through other forms of support, such as, for example, provision of material aid or additional training. And this is really dependent on the action plan that has been developed together with the communities. And of course, for the community and for NRC to really be receptive to the changing local dynamics and conflict environment, it's really key that throughout all the process, there is a continuous process of information gathering, analysis, and strategies building that is done together with the communities. And this also helps to influence the exit planning and sustainability, but also it helps to monitor the effectiveness of the CSP strategies and action that the communities have decided to prioritize to prevent or mitigate violence. So throughout the whole process, NRC team plays more a role of a facilitator, whereas the community is really at the center of the identification and implementation of their own solution. Even next slide, please. So yes, here just some example of strategies that we have supported in the country offices where we implement CSP programs. So they really range from early warning and contingency planning, safe evacuation and negotiation to return, self-protective behavior, safe shelter for displaced families, but also support to nonviolent community self-defense group, especially in Colombia, community-led negotiations for weapon-free village, community-led advocacy towards harmed groups. And I would like to briefly present you an example from the program in Afghanistan. So in the north, in the provinces of Kunduz and Balkh, NRC has implemented a multi-year CSP program, and both provinces experience frontline conflict, so with fluctuations in lines of control. And the fluctuating front lines resulted in displacement for most of the communities, which was a core focus of the protection program, and opened communities to targeting by armed groups, both directly and indirectly. So when we met with the communities, they were reporting a high level of heavy weaponry being used within their civilian spaces, but also human rights abuse by armed actors, contamination, occupation of civilian infrastructure. So the program really wanted to concentrate on these particular concerns that the communities were reporting. So in spring of 2021, at the height of the conflict between the Taliban and the former government, so the protection committee in one of the village found that a police commander had moved into town with several bodyguards, armed vehicles, and assorted weaponry. So the community really feared the militarization of their civilian neighborhood, and also they feared that the presence of the commander could risk them making a target of armed attacks. So the decision of the committee throughout the process was to speak to the commander directly, explaining that the village was a civilian space and convening all the community concerns. And the protection committee basically offered to the commander two possible options. The first one, to dismiss the armed guards and store the weaponry at a nearby police station, or they could relocate to an area with fewer civilians. And by recognizing this unified stance of the community, but also the growing pressure from the local authorities, the commander ultimately agreed to disarm. And he also expressed surprise that the protection committee knew the distinction, for example, between civilians and combatants, and was also able to use knowledge in their advocacy efforts. And the protection committee basically explained that they had been trained on concepts related to protections of civilians and international humanitarian law, and all these build their confidence to advocate for their rights, using also appropriate and convincing language in their argument. So we believe this story, it's important because it shows how self-protection strategies that were chosen and prioritized and implemented by the community. So in this case, we see they decided to use advocacy towards harmed actors, but also exercising collective influence as a protection committee have really helped them to prevent further violence. But also, it's really an example of civilian agency, because we believe it demonstrates that civilian, by applying CSP tools, they can really create a space to keep their family safe, even in the midst of a conflict. Finally, for us, it also showed a positive consequence of influencing local government structures, because the committee, so we lost contact with the committee for several months. And when we came back, we found out, and the committee informed us, that the committee structures has now become a part of the village structure. And they aim to basically address conflict through mediation, negotiation, and dialogue. So for us, this example really illustrates the importance of civilian self-protection as a program that is really community-led, community-inspired, and community-sustained. If you can just maybe briefly show the other slides, these are pictures from the work that is done with communities. So it's really bringing the community together, creating dialogue, listening to them, and together with them identify their priorities. There is just another slide. Yes. And if you would like to know more about the CSP program, there is myself or my colleague Anthony Nolan as global lead for protection in NRC. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Carolina. Fascinating example as well, and loved the aspect of sustainability too, so community sustainable. So really great. And again, if you have questions for Carolina, please feel free to start putting them in the question and answer box. Next, we're going to turn to Marta Palak. And she was trained originally as a lawyer before becoming a humanitarian specialist in community-based protection and participatory approaches and accountability and gender and diversity inclusion. She spent the last 15 years of experience having worked with a number of various organizations in 22 conflict-affected countries, including protracted conflict and post-conflict situations. Her focus is on people-centered and participatory programs in which people are recognized as partners and experts of their own situation. Currently, Marta works for the ICRC at the Central Tracing Agency, but knowing this, she continues promoting the people-centered approach in her private capacity. And I just want to make sure that others know that Marta confirms that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation and in the publication are entirely her own, and they don't represent or constitute the official view or position of the ICRC. So over to you, Marta.
Yes, I was muted. So thank you very much for this presentation. And also I'm very happy to be among such an inspiring panelist and to see that there are so many people listening to us. So welcome to everybody. So thank you very much to raise that disclaimer. And I would like to also add that since I worked for various organizations and in different contexts, all the case studies and the examples that I'm referring to, I decontextualize them and I focus more on the outcome rather than where and with whom it occurred. So having said that, I'd like to start this presentation by reminding a story that for me was really an eye-opener. It was 8 years ago when I was supporting an organization in conducting workshop with the communities affected by the conflict. So it was in an area where there was a presence of a particular armed group, and so different community members were discussing their main issue, and the group of women was raising the issue of risk of being exposed to sexual violence. And when we discussed further with this particular group, with those women, they were telling us that in fact, when they were collecting firewoods in the forest, they could be exposed to attack, and they knew exactly who were the perpetrators. So we asked them, okay, so what do you do to reduce those exposures? So some of them said, well, what we do is we basically stop going to the forest because it's too dangerous. Another group was saying, well, in fact, what we do is that we continue, and even it is a lucrative activities, because now we can even sell our extra firewoods to the market. And then they were explaining to us that one day before going to the wood, they would constitute in a group and they would go and speak with this particular armed group, and they were asking to meet a representative, a commander, and they would explain them the exact locations where they would go. And then they were telling us, so what we wanted is to raise in them the feeling of responsibility. So it was not to accuse them, but it was rather to ask them for protection. So we asked them, is it working? And they were telling us, well, sometimes it's working when we had the opportunity to meet the ones that we spoke to, but we don't know if the message passes to everyone, so it's still a risk for us. So when we brainstormed together, so how would you like to be supported? The woman expressed, well, can you help us to better negotiate our safety? Or even better, can you come with us so our message will be stronger? Well, at that time, this organization did not have that in their portfolio. So what we proposed to them is to collect the cases and have a confidential dialogue with this particular group to remind them their obligation in regards to international humanitarian law. And then the woman stopped us abruptly saying, why would you speak about us without us? And why would you open a dialogue when we already have our own dialogue? And also they were saying, and you are leaving, we are staying. Why can't you do what we are asking you to do? And this was for me really this trigger. And in fact, this particular organization then started to develop the humanitarian mediation programming to support communities who already have a dialogue or who are willing to have a dialogue with any actors who can positively or negatively influence their safety. And this brings me, next slide, please. And this brings me to, I would say, the fundamental pillar of the people-centered approach, which is to recognize that self-determination is an essential element of human dignity. And having that in mind, it is to see people, as Felicity and Carolina was saying, as experts of their own situation and as partners, because at the end of the day, they are the real frontliners. They are the one, they don't wait for a humanitarian organization to come. They already developed their own strategy. So the idea is really how we can build on what is existing there. And next slide, please. So this people-centered approach is an area-based approach. So basically, it is a methodology that builds on partnership with local, international, multi-sectorial, multidisciplinary organization in order to propose a solution with the cooperation of the communities. So here it's an 8-step base. I will not go to all the steps because we don't have time for that. But what I want to just give you specifically on the left side, the idea is that for organization in a given context that wants to work together, that share the common principles such as neutrality, independence, the do no harm principles, choose a community that they would like to work with. And on the stage 2, they meet directly with the communities and they adopt what we call the blank slate approach, what also Felicity was referring to. So basically, letting the community to choose what is their entry point to the question, what are your main threats and what are your main concerns? And here the idea is also not even to impose, I would say, a protection thematic, but leave the people to choose their own entry point. And I had the opportunity to work in 22 contexts, and very often communities, they want to speak about their lack of access to essential services, such as lack of access to food or to medical healthcare. So when I had my protection hat, I was a bit nervous thinking, okay, but we might miss the conversation of protection. And in fact, most of the time, if not always, it doesn't matter the entry point, because at the end of the day, everything is interlinked. And we see that if someone, for example, says, I don't have access to food, that's my main concern. When we dig further throughout this methodology, so we don't come with a preconceived questions, it's really a conversation. We found out, okay, why don't you have access to food? Well, because I cannot have access to my field. Why don't you have access to food? Because there are mines, or I am afraid to be caught in a crossfire. So very often, if the exercise was done at the first stage, where you choose a community that is affected by a humanitarian crisis, very often the protection concerns come on its own. And then at the consolidation stage, that's where organizations sit together and they see, based on the comparative advantage, who is the best positioned to address issue at various levels. And I will come to that in a minute. But now the initial planning, this is where we do the how with the community. So once we have identified at the stage 2, what are the main issues, what are already the existing capacity of the communities, how they would like to be, what are the solutions that they see as potential to support them, it is to see how they would like to be supported. So presenting to the community what every organization could do to address their main issues that they have shared with us. And here, I would like to share with you another case study, which was close to a front line, where there was again a lot of presence of weapon bearers. And because of the deterioration of the protection situation, a lot of state services have left. And one of the main that really the communities depended on was the bus state service. And because it was interrupted, so there were no more as well medical services. Communities, members that remained did not have cars, so they had to walk by foot over 10 kilometers to the first bus station and to be able to reach a town for their medical or for their administrative issues. And throughout the discussion, one of the main solutions that was proposed by the community was to restore the bus service. So at the stage 3, when the organization brainstormed how they could support, one of the organization proposed to actually provide grants for those villages and to buy minibus in order to restore the services, along also with negotiation with the armed group to cease a fire when they would drive. And when we came back to the community, they did not like that solution. And they told us, well, that's not your responsibility, that's the state responsibility. We don't want you. And plus, how can we ensure that this will be sustainable over time? So in fact, what happened there is that the community, the organization withdrew, and the community with the representative had a meeting at the Ministry of Transport to reevaluate the security situation, and the bus service was restored, and the humanitarian organization helped in the negotiation of a ceasefire on those particular days. And here, that's the example of the importance to also engage the community, not only on the what, but exactly on the how they would like to be supported. And then if you look at the right side, it's following very much I would say the classic project cycle. So I will not go too much into that because I see that I'm running out of time. So next slide, please. Here I would like to focus on the complementarity element. So as I was telling you at the stage 3, what is this methodology is inviting various organizations to look and to position themselves as a piece of the puzzle of the potential responses. We have among our humanitarian, but also development, but also civil agencies, various actors that can play an essential role at various, I would say, levels. So, for example, at the advocacy level, how to influence and creative and conducive environment. At the level of the duty bearers, how to engage them, how to do prevention activities. At the level of vulnerability reduction activities, exactly what Felicity and Carolina were explaining, how to develop further self-protection activities directly with the community. And also, let's not forget the remedial level, how to help people who have been already affected and who suffered from their protection violations. So it's really to have all those organizations, and if we can go to the next slide, that shows how this is, can we go to the next slide, please? That shows how do we, so here on the first picture, you see how organizations themselves can be part of this big puzzle of the responses. So I'd like to end on this complementarity element that is fundamental in the people-centered approach, where every organization, as I said, is part of this process, and where people are engaged throughout the entire steps of the roadmap. And just one word also on the nexus. When we engage with communities, we realize as well that very often when they propose solutions, even though we came with a humanitarian hat, they had solutions that were of, I would say, very much development or sometimes even peace building nature. And here, when I say the peace building nature, I would like just to bring a clarification. That's what we mean at the very local level. So when the state apparatus is not here, when communities are together, very often they were mentioning the issue of the lack of social cohesion, or even at the very local level, how they can have a coexistence with the armed bearers, armed groups. So I'm really mentioning here the local peace component rather than the political peace component that is happening at the institutional level. And finally, about the localization and engaging with local actors, and as Felicity was mentioning in her presentation, that's where, of course, they bring their expertise, they bring this proximity, but also the international actors, they could also bring and share their capital of reputation and their more easiness to have access to funding. So it's really see how everyone can bring this piece, their solution to this big puzzle of potential responses. Next slide. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marta. That was really rich, and can see your passion coming through as well, which is really exciting because these approaches are so critical in helping people feel safe. So thank you, everybody, Felicity, Carolina, and Marta, for sharing your experience in the examples from the organizations that you've been working with, and what this really means to engage with communities, but really support their own leadership and help embrace that. We have a number of questions already coming in. I think some of them are starting to be answered. Hopefully you can see those popping up on your screen. But I have a couple of questions as well, as I wanted to start off with each of the three panelists. And as well, we'll start to merge in some of the audience questions as well. But one question that I wanted to start with from each of you is we hear the rhetoric, I guess you would say, of the term or the focus of people-centered. And I wonder if you can break that down a bit for me, each of you, and what do you think people-centered really means? What does that look like? And then perhaps maybe also build on that to help us understand then what resources does your organization need then to create this space for centering communities. And I'm open to whoever wants to go first.
Maybe I can start.
Sure.
Yeah. So I said this also during the presentation. So I mean, centering communities for us, it means really works with and not on behalf of the communities. So through the CSP program, to the maximum extent, we try to follow the community's own priorities, and jointly with them we'll look and explore if and how we can further support them and their priorities. And this can be done, for example, through strengthening technical capacities or by material support for them to implement their self-protection actions and strategies more effectively. So as an external actor, we'll always try to be careful not to undermine like grassroots ownership and autonomy. And in terms of what is needed, we have seen that the aspect of promoting community engagement and community dialogue is really, really important, as well as try to build on prior experience and existing community structures, and really look at how we can strengthen or expand these protection mechanism. As we said, like most of the time, communities that they know what they need the most. And so when they are empowered with knowledge, trainings, material, they can really support those efforts to reach protection outcome. And for us, even in the technical capacity building, all the support that we provide, it's also key to let the communities lead on deciding a little bit the nature and the form of the capacity building support. Internally, it has not been always easy to promote this kind of approach, but it was important for us, first of all, to understand that the CSP program is not intended as a substitute for specialized responses, but more as a program that can complement, that can be an addition, and it can really open to a different way also of collaborating between different forms of collaboration between like NGOs and the communities, and really like enrich more the traditional programming. In our experience, it also like challenged a little bit the power dynamics between the NGOs, like between us and the communities, but it challenged it in a positive way, because of course there is so much that we can provide to the communities, but there is also so much that they can support us with, in terms of really understanding the context we work with, and then how to also better like intervene and support. So it's really it was really important for us to change that logic that this is like a specialty in itself, like working with communities and putting them at the center. So it was not meant to replace anything, our expertise, but rather complement it.
Great, thank you. Do Marta or Felicity, do you want to jump in and add anything, or did she cover it?
I might jump in. Obviously, I would echo everything that Carolina has said. You know, it's really about orienting ourselves to the communities first and foremost, and their needs and their desires. And I think we've all, in every presentation, that was such a clear thread. Perhaps I'll just reflect, we had a little bit of this in the chat around what a people-centered or an unarmed civilian protection approach would look like when it comes to risk to local actors. I think this is a really key question that, you know, as we orient protection in communities themselves, that this is not just a risk transfer exercise, where we really need to think about how people are equipped to manage their own security. And so that's a key issue, I think, for us, not just paying lip service to some of these concepts, and not just paying lip service to localization, right? I think in the sector we hear that a lot. It means really grounding leadership from the outset in communities themselves. And in terms of the resource part of your question, Jessica, that really means that resources have to be set up by donors in a way that allows that to happen, which is not always the case. I think we've all had experiences where we're trying to do this kind of work, but meeting challenges when it comes to reporting, or when it comes to who holds money or who is allowed to hold money. And I think we've done a lot of advocacy on this in Ukraine, and the PPE library that I mentioned came out of, I think, longer term advocacy efforts in relation to the pooled fund in Ukraine, where a small envelope was opened up for organizations like NP or registered national NGOs in Ukraine could directly apply to the fund, but that particular envelope was set aside specifically for activities with volunteer collectives who weren't otherwise eligible to apply for that kind of funding. And so there's questions around, reporting requirements and liability, and, we can all talk about that for many, many hours. But I think what that small envelope demonstrates is that it is possible to get creative with these requirements and to find pathways through that might not necessarily look exactly as we had hoped, but are certainly better than the alternative, which is just big NGOs holding all of the resources and therefore a lot of power.
Yeah, so I think most was already said by and covered by Carolina and Felicity. Maybe one point about how to center the communities that I would like to mention is also the work, the words that we use, the way we define protection. This is where it's very important also to consider what is the definition given by the people, and that was also covered in your presentation, Felicity. But also to remind that for many people, protection is actually to stay safe and with their physical integrity, whereas in the humanitarian sphere, we a lot talk about the rights, the fact of having all the activities that respect the international humanitarian law, I would say the bodies of rights, whereas when you speak with people, it's much more concrete. And this is where being people-centered is also to adapt our language, the way people are understanding concepts to them, so that we at the end of the day, we adapt us and our programming to the situation rather than, I would say, them adapting to the way we are sectorized, to the way we have different, discipline. And this is exactly what I was telling you in my presentation is how we make sure that our response is not divided in the way that we are divided as an aid community. And as I was telling you, very often when we discuss with communities, they come with solutions that is really touching a lot of activities that one organization cannot hold it all. So being, I would say, community-centered is really also adapting ourselves to what the community is proposing. And I fully agree with what you were saying, Felicity, on the localization agenda. I think there is still a lot of work to be done in this regard, to not see local agency as implementing partners, but just see them as design partners. And this is where I strongly believe that bigger players could have also an enabling role, because it will not happen only with I would say with them coming into ground. It will happen as well if bigger players will let them this space. And that's why I believe that this has to be done with letting them the space. So really sharing the power of decision, the power of funding.
Thank you, all three of you. Really, really important messages there for everybody as we think about this approach and really putting people at the center and what that really means. There's a lot of questions actually coming in on measurement, and I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that in this approach. I mean, when we talk about results-based protection, there's a critical piece about how do you actually measure the protection outcome, the risk reduction. And so if we're using this approach and really engaging communities at the center, how have you done this? Have you measured their participation or their leadership in solutions and reducing risk? And what does that look like? What methods are you using? How has it worked or how has it not? What challenges are you finding as well? So happy to hear from any of you in terms of how your organizations are doing that, how they're embracing it, or if you're struggling with it yourself, and what we can learn from it. Carolina, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
It looks like you're ready.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So as I was telling you, in 2022, we have assisted communities in several countries, so Afghanistan, Colombia, Honduras, and as I said, we are supporting them to implement proactive protections initiatives, right? And these initiatives were identified through these community-led processes, so mapping risk and threats, and then developing strategies to prevent or interrupt violence from happening. But together with this work, we have also supported communities to try to monitor the effectiveness of these civilian self-protection efforts. And we have done it by drawing on a new analysis framework. So with the analysis framework, we mainly use 12 tools that have both dual purpose, but also standalone, to collect and review data with a layered approach. So it really begins with analysis, so individual pieces, which then gets pulled together in a synthesis, which considers the whole and the parts together at the same time, helping really to understand relationships and connections. So you really need to imagine like a puzzle pieces. So each piece will give us information, but then to be able to complete, to really see the full picture, you need to put all these puzzle pieces together. So all these tools that we have divided into mainly 3 sets, a curriculum set, an implementation set, and evaluation set, have been designed in a very participatory approach. So the beneficiary participate in the data collection, analysis, and interpretation. So I give you an example. When comparing baseline and endline findings, so NRC, we engage with the communities to understand from their perspective why changes may have occurred and what might have contributed to those changes. So with the analysis framework, we really try to determine a new way of contribution of specific activities to the community's perceptions of safety and prevention of violence. And of course, this involves that changes must be tracked over a certain period of time to determine whether the civilian self-protection approach were effective, but also to increase our own capacities for knowledge and learning about what have contributed to change. So just maybe to give you an example, then I'll stop. So if, for example, individuals in a community that's been targeted by the NRC CSP activities feel safer than they did that here earlier, of course, correlating with when NRC CSP activity started, this does not mean that the CSP intervention necessarily caused this perceived change. So with the framework and the M&E system that we have put in place, we want to be able to explore what they feel safer in relation to. Is it to a specific threat? Is it to like a specific instance of that threat? And why they feel differently, and how NRC action did or did not contribute to that change. And of course, to understand this process, then we look also to triangulate this information that come from the communities with other monitoring data, such as, for example, protection incident tracking, but also changes in context, other perceived changes. So we really work at different level and then put all the information together. But it's a complex task. It's really not easy.
Yeah. Felicity or Marta, did you want to add on? Have you seen your organizations try to use outcome-oriented methods for measuring some of this?
I guess what I just add is that not all of this has to be done from scratch. I think there are some good frameworks out there that do seek to embody these principles that are ready and available for organizations big and small to be learning from and utilizing. So something like everyday peace indicators, that's a community where a community of thought, perhaps, where as Carolina was saying, indicators have to come from the community themselves, and we track over time. And there is a lot of this work happening. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel necessarily. We do need to be really specific about context and community need when we're implementing them. But a lot of those lessons are being learned, and that conversation is ongoing.
Yes, I think everything was covered with what Felicity and Carolina was saying.
Great. Yeah, and I just wanted to put a plug in as well. So Interaction obviously has been working on the measurement piece for quite some time. And in 2020 or 21, we launched the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Evaluation Framework, which is focused at GBV in complex situations. But we have, I found that many organizations just working on other types of protection issues have found this guidance really helpful. And within that guidance, there's a number of tools and methods that are introduced to humanitarians that have been tailored to the humanitarian situation, particularly also for protection and GBV issues, that you can use to start to think about how do you measure at an outcome level. So we introduce methods such as outcome harvesting, most significant change, process tracing, the use of proxy indicators, and other tools and methods that are in there. So please refer to our website as well to download that and to learn from it. We also have a community of practice if you'd like to engage with the challenges of using it as well and share your experience. So we only have a couple more minutes left for this, and actually 2 more minutes. And so I know there was a ton of questions. We're going to try to get to them all. If they're not answered now, we'll try to get back to you and get them back to everybody when we also download this video on our website. But I wanted to allow each of you, of the panelists, to give maybe a final word, maybe kind of a key message you want to leave with everybody before we close. And again, I really thank you for your presentations. They've been rich, super passionate. And I think the humanitarian community still has a long way to go to really embrace this. But there are little things that I think we can each do to start. And so I hope that with your messages and what you've already been able to share is inspiration for others to try. So maybe Marta, do you want to kick us off with some final thoughts?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for your attention. My final words maybe is that the people-centered approach is one methodology among others. And I really hope it can inspire various organizations, various actors which aim to support people who are affected by a humanitarian crisis to come and jointly work together, as this is a quite simple step methodology to actually really create a partnership, a collaboration, and not just an exchange of information and referral system. So I hope it can inspire some actors who are in one area to test that tool and to come together. And it's very complementary to what other organizations are already doing in terms of self-protection activities. So it really comes more as a way to cooperate together with various actors. So if you're interested, you can contact me, and I hope soon I will have the web page ready where all the methodology will be explained in detail, and that will be, I hope, inspiring to be replicated elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. Felicity?
Thank you everyone for this discussion. It's been great to be involved. I think it's really telling that you can have three quite different perspectives in this conversation that all are centering communities in different ways and all looking to extend how protection is being conventionally understood. I think that this ecosystem is clearly becoming more diverse, and different ideas are coming from different organizations and different communities and different contexts. That's really exciting. And I think it demonstrates this conversation has and is moving significantly more towards where we want to see it going. So again, thank you so much for the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. And Carolina?
Yeah, thank you for all the colleagues who have speak today, and it was really a privilege to be among the panelists. And thank you also to all the colleagues who took the time this morning to listen to us. Maybe I will just conclude by saying that, I mean, working with communities and promoting these community-led responses is in its own way a specialty. So I really hope that we will continue to collectively try to supporting these kind of approaches in somehow also finding like a seat at the main donor table, cluster table, because protection outcomes like great results can be achieved really through these genuine, equal, and respectful collaboration between local agency and external aid. So I really hope that these collective efforts to promote this kind of approach will continue and will just continue to grow.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presenters today. Really rich, really inspiring, and I really appreciate each of the messages. Again, this is really core to results-based approaches to protection. If we're really, as a community, trying to achieve protection outcomes, which is really ensuring that people are free from violence, coercion, and deliberate deprivation, we really need to start with people themselves and support and enable them to lead these approaches. So very thankful for all of you for sharing your experience, what this looks like practically, how you could do it, and in quite diverse contexts as well, that it is possible. So just a big thank you to our donor, CEDA, who has helped us support results-based protection, but also the documentation of case examples. And hopefully we'll be able to do more and share more so that others can learn and adopt these practices in their own work. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I know we didn't get to all the questions. We will try to get to them and get back to you individually, and then certainly post them on our website. So thank you again, and look forward to the next series.